Thank you so much for the CMS team for hosting this symposium and inviting me to speak to you all today. So depending on where you are in the world, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, and thank you for joining us today for this panel. My name is Bianca Lee, and I'm the Director of Cellular Agriculture Australia. We are a non-profit dedicated to promoting and accelerating research and development in the cell ag sector here in Australia. Today, I am moderating this session from Naarm, or you may be more familiar with it as Melbourne, which is the land of our Aboriginal peoples, the Wurundjeri and Bunurong peoples of the Kulin Nation. So Womanjeka, or welcome in the Woiwurrung language, to this panel where we'll be uncovering the role of national nonprofits in the international cell ag space. Our panel will be discussing how different nonprofit organisations around the world are working independently or collaboratively to help regulate cell ag products. And you may be familiar already with some of the existing multinational nonprofits doing some incredible work in the space, like New Harvest and the Good Food Institute, both of whom have really paved the commercial and regulatory landscape to what it is today through public advocacy, funding support, science communication, and facilitating collaboration and networking. And as the sector grows, there is an increasing need for independent region-specific organisations who not only have an expertise in their own country's existing food policies and the agencies who regulate these novel food technologies, but more importantly, who also have a nuanced understanding of their community's cultural values and how to best engage with and educate local consumers. So fortunately, we have 4 experts from 4 different countries here to discuss how their organisations are tackling some of these regulatory challenges. So as Anita already mentioned, we have Nathalie Rolland, co-founder and president of Cellular Agriculture France, Dr. Neil Stevens, sociologist at Brunel University London and co-founder of Cultivate in the UK, Sam Lawrence, director of policy and government relations at Food Frontier in Australia and New Zealand, and Yadira Tejeda-Saldana, co-founder and director of Cellular Agriculture Canada. So first, I'd just like to briefly explain the format of this session. Each speaker will start by presenting, in the style of a 3-minute thesis, if you're familiar with that, a high-level overview of how their organisations are currently helping regulate cell ag in their country. We'll then move on to the panel discussion, and towards the end, there'll be about 15 minutes for audience questions. So starting in alphabetical order, we have Nathalie.
Hello, so I'm Nathalie Rolland. I've been working on the development of cellular agriculture for a few years. I started working with Mark Post at the Maastricht University. We worked together on a consumer acceptance study that was published in a few months ago. Since then, I continued. I was willing to continue working on this topic. So I joined a project with a research institution in France, and I also started working with a food awareness organization. And I co-founded the French organization non-profit Agriculture Cellulaire France, so CELAG France. So this is the non-profit dedicated to cellular agriculture development in France. And what we do is that we aim to inform the people, to stimulate the debate around the topic in France. So inform the general public, inform the people in the food industry, the politicians, really everybody, and inform these people in French as well. And we also want to encourage research, to have public and open research. We think this is also very important. And so we have a website, and you can contact us with this email address. So the next slide.
Thanks, Nathalie. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and so briefly, so about the regulations in Europe. So I'm not a specialist on that, but from what I understood, the basic process of the regulation for the cell ag product in Europe is that we need a pre-market authorization for this product. And for the meat, it depends on the type of cell that the companies are going to use. If they are going to not genetically modify the cell, they will go through the novel food regulation. And if they are going to genetically modify the cell they use, they will have to deal with the EU GMO legislation. And so the basic process of the novel food regulation. So the idea is to send an application to the European Commission. Then the European Commission might forward this application to the EFSA, so the European Food Safety Authority, to conduct a safety assessment. And then if the novel food fulfill health and safety criteria according to the European Commission, they will authorize, they will be authorized by the Commission. They will be added on the union list of the approved novel food, and the product will be approved for market use. So we'll have to, some part of the process, and I guess the majority of the process will have to happen on the European level, but we'll also have some things on national levels, and also some regulatory agencies involved in the process. So for example, in France, the ANSES agency will be involved. And for example, they will have to deal with the inspection and the enforcement of that on national level. And we also, it seems that what we have to deal with on national level is especially the things about the communication and how to advertise the product. So there are just a few information on that. So we'll have to deal with things on European level and also national levels in Europe.
Great, thank you. Next we have Neil.
Hi everybody, thank you for coming today. Yes, my name is Neil Stevens. I'm at Brunel University London. I'm also a co-founder of a group called Cultivate, which is what I'm here to talk about today. Cultivate was founded, I guess you would say, in 2006 by a group of 5. I'll tell you all about all of us in a moment. And we position ourselves as a multi-voice forum to discuss cellular agriculture from UK perspectives. There's quite a lot of plurality in that, multi-voiced and UK perspectives. We're very much about giving a platform for diverse opinions and diverse forms of expertise about cellular agriculture. And we're also, I think we're perhaps a little different to some of the other organizations in that, to be honest, I'm not sure we're as successful at this as yet as we hope to, but we're also keen to give platforms for voices that are not always positive about cellular agriculture, are not always fully embracing of the ideas, because we want to have informed dialogue in the broadest sense. In practice, what we do is relatively limited. When we set this up, we came up with a long list of things we wanted to accomplish, or things that would be nice to accomplish, and we decided to do a relatively small subset of those things and try to do them relatively well. So the core things that we do are we host an annual event, started in 2016. Every year it's been a full day in-person event, but this year, like everyone else, we're doing it online. It's going to be on the 17th of December. It's probably, we haven't finalized it yet. It's not going to be very long. It's going to be about 2 or 3 or 4 hours, something like that. It's the week after Mark Post's Maastricht conference, and we're basically going to use a similar profile, similar format to what they're using, which is a reduced form as well. And we also write publications, policy publications, but also academic publications. There's 5 of us, myself, I'm an academic sociologist, Marianne Ellis, who's a chemical engineer at Bath University and is also in the company Cellular Agriculture Limited. Alexandra Sexton is a geographer and sort of food studies, critical food studies analyst, currently based at Oxford University. Abigail Glencross, who was a one-time New Harvest funded PhD student doing some of the early work on cultured meat, and Icted Dunsford, who is also involved in the company Cellular Agriculture Limited, but was originally and still is involved in farming with livestock. Nathalie just gave a great overview of the EU role of regulation. As you're probably aware, the UK is currently in this complex process of extracting itself from the EU. And quite what that will mean is still under development, but certainly we have a regulatory body called the Food Standards Agency, the FSA, and they will be, defining the procedures around safety and quality and those types of issues. I think that's enough for me for now.
Great, thank you, Neil. And next we have Sam.
Thanks, Bianca. So Food Frontier is a think tank and advisor on alternative proteins in Australia and New Zealand. We're about 3 years old and we're not for profit and we're philanthropically funded. If you just jump to the next slide, please. So our work covers two main thematic areas, as you can see there, thought leadership and advising industry. And that can be split across three work areas. The first is food industry, so that's connections and opportunities and barriers. And the second is communications, right through from media engagement through to research, and that can be research we do in-house or research that we contract. And examples of that are economic analysis, where we contracted Deloitte Access Economics to quantify the size of the plant-based meat market on a national economy, Australia's. Consumer research to look at dietary trends and propensity to consume and purchasing behavior around plant-based meat. And a nutritional analysis, which is the most recent research report that we published, which examined the nutritional composition of all plant-based meats in Australia and New Zealand and compared them to their conventional meat counterparts. And that was to address some myths that are emerging in the media around healthfulness of plant-based meats, such as sodium content, for example. The third main area of work is around policy, and that involves regulations and working with regulators, the agriculture sector and policymakers, and that's the area of work that I'm mostly involved with. If we jump onto the next slide, please. So the regulator in this part of the world is FSANZ, Food Standards Australia and New Zealand, and that's a joint regime between both countries, Australia and New Zealand. In terms of the process, FSANZ develops the technical standards. So I imagine they're very similar to the FSA, as Neil was just talking about in the UK. Those technical standards are then given to another body with the name of the Australia-New Zealand Ministerial Forum on Food Regulation, a very snappily titled body. And that's composed of a minister for each state and territory of Australia, plus the federal government of Australia and the government of New Zealand. And in certain circumstances, the government of New Zealand can opt out of joint standards if it needs to. In terms of cellular agriculture, FSANZ is of the opinion that existing standards are adequate to cover the emergence of cellular agriculture products. So depending on the composition of the cell-based meat, for example, those standards could include novel foods, processing aids, food additives, labeling, and so on. It's worth noting that FSANZ works very closely with and pays very close attention to international developments. And it's certainly looking very closely at what the USDA and the FDA are doing currently in the US. If we jump onto the final slide, please, Bianca. So this is an overview of Australia's alternative protein landscape right now. We prepared these slides, I think, Bianca, correct me if I'm wrong, I think I sent them to you earlier this week. And it's already out of date. We've identified an additional company in Queensland. So as you can see, the sector is growing pretty quickly, even between putting these slides together and talking to you today. So that's enough from me. And I think these slides will be available after today's session. Happy to take any questions.
Great, thanks, Sam. And finally, we have Yadira.
Thank you, Bianca. I'm really excited to be here talking about the work that we've been doing at CAC here in Canada. We are one of the first not-for-profit organizations, and we're the first not-for-profit here in Canada that is trying to promote and support the emerging field of cellular agriculture. We're focusing on two main sets of activities. One of them is knowledge mobilization, and the other one is talent support. And for the purpose of this presentation, I'm going to focus on knowledge mobilization. If you haven't heard about what does knowledge mobilization mean, it is a way of distributing knowledge and evidence in a way that is easily accessible, that is useful, and that is actually used by people. And there's different platforms and different techniques that we can use in order to achieve this. So knowledge mobilization is really important for policy and for policymaking and regulations, because we need to make sure that decision makers have at hand all the evidence that is necessary to create effective regulations. And I think we have a unique position as not-for-profits in that we are able to anticipate to the needs, because we are in touch with all the different stakeholders and we know what's going on in the field. So we're able to know what type of information is going to be needed for regulators to make effective policies. And regarding that, I want to talk about one of our most recent initiatives that we work on. So if we can move to the next slide, Bianca, please. We recently published a white paper that highlights or outlines the basic steps for how these products are going to be regulated in Canada. This was the result of a preliminary meeting that we had with regulators, and we thought it would be important for us to share that knowledge that we gathered during that meeting in a simple guide that can help select companies understand or start looking at the first steps that they will need to follow once they have products available. During this writing process, we received constant feedback from regulators, from agencies like Health Canada, the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, and Environment and Climate Change Canada, which are going to be the three agencies involved in the regulatory process of cultured food products. And we also were lucky to have the support of people from AAFC, which is Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, involved during this process. Now, what is important about this as well is that we need to have a conversation, and we need to engage also stakeholders in deciding or talking about how these products are going to be regulated. So we put a call for comments for this paper, and we were lucky to receive some comments about it. And the whole idea was to know what are the areas of concern, what are some topics that are still not really clear and that need more information from regulators. And our next step is actually putting a panel where we're going to invite some of these regulators to engage in a discussion with other stakeholders that are involved in the field. And this is actually our first attempt of bringing and creating a collaborative regulatory environment here in Canada. We are trying to anticipate to those needs.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone, for those introductions and for giving us an insight of, the small fraction of work each of your organizations are doing. It's clear that there are many differences in your approaches to engage with different stakeholders like policymakers, consumers, and even the media. And that makes sense given the differences in your backgrounds and the different contexts that you're dealing with. So my first question is about whether or not there are similarities too. Is there international consensus on the messaging and the positioning of cellular agriculture to use when talking to these different stakeholder groups? For example, when we're talking about labeling of Stellag products, approaches to engaging with government, how to collaborate with the existing agriculture industry. So my question in short is there international consensus when it comes to how we talk about cellular agriculture to stakeholders?
Shall I go first, or I don't have to?
Yeah, thanks, Neil. That'd be great.
Sure. Is there international consensus? Probably. I mean, formally, I don't think that there is certainly amongst this particular group. I've not kind of signed up onto any shared terms that anyone else is suggesting for us. And actually, as Cultivate, as I've said and might say a few more times, we do things our own kind of way, and we're not really about trying to force everyone to say the same things at the same time. That's kind of, to a certain extent, the opposite of what we're trying to do. At the same time, I do think within the culture meat community more broadly, there is a kind of a centre ground. And I'm not sure if centre ground is the right word, but there is a general shared vision for what people think the technology should do and how it should be. There's disputes within that and discussions within that, but I think there is a level of shared comment. I don't know if anyone else wants to agree or contradict.
I might jump in if that's okay, Bianca. One of your points, Bianca, there was around collaboration and labeling, and it's a very live conversation that we have here in Australia with the shadow of what's happening in the European Parliament this week as well in terms of labeling around the plant-based products. There is, it's fair to say, no consensus at the moment in an Australian context. There are a variety of views between traditional agriculture sectors and the emerging alternative protein space. Those conversations, however, are coalescing into fora, such as a forum that we've recently established with the National Farmers Federation, so the peak farm advocacy body in Australia, where we can have those conversations in a constructive way. I think to date, a lot of that conversation has been conducted in the media, which isn't the most constructive way to have a conversation around a policy issue. But we're starting to see that collaboration between disparate sectors taking place now, which is a positive move.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I'm curious to know, Yadira, considering you've developed the white paper and currently getting consultations from different stakeholders in Canada, have you reached out to people in the international space, and is there international consensus there?
It's a really good question. And I think consensus, right now, I don't think we have reached it so far. I think there's still a lot of differences. Just thinking about terminology, there's still a lot of ways that we're calling these products. And I think somehow that's okay, because we're talking about food. And when we talk about food, we're also, we need to be aware of the cultural or the traditions that exist in each country. So there might be possibilities for having different perspectives of how, for example, these products are going to be called in each country. But I think somehow, as not-for-profits, we have a unique position that we are not really involved in a competitive environment, and that we can somehow streamline maybe the kind of messages that we want to put out there from the field, the select field in general. I was hearing yesterday to the panel where Neil was also part, and for example, Lisha mentioned something important and that I kept in my head, that we somehow need to make sure that the industry is still used for good, and that somehow I think that's a good opportunity for not-for-profits as us to keep that essence of the field, and to try to streamline and to bring together the different stakeholders to keep that message and that essence of the field alive as well. So again, it's not a matter of consensus. I think it's just a matter of streamlining our messages and adapting them in a way that are advantageous for our countries.
Yeah, exactly. And, you know, all these nonprofits are, you know, working together and collaborating. Nathalie, considering you're based in the EU, who do you think is responsible for encouraging, you know, all of these nonprofits to talk to each other and share strategies?
I don't know who is responsible, but I think that we also have to think of the terminology in our own language. So it's yeah, because maybe we can yeah, think of the best terms in English and have maybe a consensus in English, but then we also have to think of the translations. So I guess it's going to be might be very different depending on the countries, because it seems that we are able to have very close terms in some languages, and in some other languages that's very difficult to have something close. I think that for now, and at least in France, we are discussing the terms, but it's just among the very small, say like French community. So I just what try to do is to find neutral names, descriptive names, and also have the public learning on the topic with neutral names, and not using the negative names, because sometimes we have very negative names used. But I don't know who would be should be responsible for that. Maybe like the consortium of the non-profit. But then I guess all of these organizations are going to do what they just think that will be the best for them.
If I may, Bianca, I wonder if it's not so much an individual organization that has responsibility, but a collective responsibility as not-for-profits to engage more with international counterparts. Certainly Food Frontier, when we work with our international counterparts, we learn an awful lot. And the space is evolving so fast, not just in our part of the world, but internationally. It's, as you said, it's the emergence of bodies such as ours in each part of the world, and as you can see on this call today, is important because it's impossible to stay across developments in all parts of the world. That international collaboration is absolutely essential, so that those lessons can be shared. And I think that's a responsibility that we all have.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, because, you know, each country has their own successes and failures, and we can all learn from that. So speaking about that, you know, looking outside of the field of cell ag, are there examples in your countries where, you know, there are regulatory successes or failures that you can share that could be applied to the cell ag industry?
I might jump in there again and go back to the example that I used earlier in terms of working with our national agriculture sector in the plant-based space. And I suppose the main point there is the importance of alliances and finding partners that you can work with and that want to work with you. Cellular agriculture in Australia is a small and emerging sector. Traditional agriculture is enormous and worth something in the region of 61 billion Australian dollars over the last year. So there's certainly, when talking about regulation, there's a power disparity there. And that's where the importance of having evidence-based conversations and having alliances and working with partners that want to work with you. And part of that is positioning, of course, and demonstrating that we are able to sit across the table or around the table with a diverse and divergent set of opinions and actors, such as traditional agriculture, and have conversations that are constructive. Demonstrating that is one thing, and the next step is delivering on that. But again, evidence-based conversations here rather than emotion-based conversations.
Yeah, Neil, I was wondering if you could comment based on your perspective in the UK.
I mean, I guess in terms of lessons about trying to bring regulatory practices into place, it's the obvious example that we've already heard mentioned multiple times across the conference, because the UK was certainly a place where, you know, genetically modified crops back in the 1990s was a very contentious issue, a highly politicized issue, and the politicization and the regulation have sort of co-informed each other in various ways. You asked for learning points, and my kind of standard learning point from that, when I'm talking to a cell ag audience, is to remember, as I think many people do, but some people don't, that a key issue that was raised for people who are concerned with genetically modified crops was, sure, there was lots of questions about the safety. There was also a huge amount of questions about the ownership structures and the role of large corporations or particular configurations of the economics of food that were being impacted by this technology. So I guess I would be keen for people to remember that when they're talking about GMOs and genetically modified crops, as people often do, that the ownership is as important as health and safety. I think that's the most important one that I can give. Thanks,
Neil. Yadira, did you have any comments to add on that?
Sure. My example might be a bit different. I just want to remember, in our case, for example, Canada has really close ties with the United States, and especially with trade, for example. A lot of our products cross the border several times a day. And if one thing we cannot avoid is having trade between both countries. So it is really important that regulators start the conversation about how these products are going to be regulated with for example, regulators from the US as well, because most probably a lot of these products are going to be crossing the border as well several times. And we have to ensure that those regulations that are built are trade friendly, let's say. We need to make sure, and right now, both Canada and the US have really good, they have effective regulations in place, and it's just a matter of putting all the pieces together in a way that trade is allowed and that the industry can flourish in both sides of the border.
Yeah, that's a really good point for countries that are, landlocked. Nathalie, did you have any opinions on, how you could best collaborate with, the other cellular agriculture nonprofits in the space in Europe?
I think it's, well, at least for us, the beginning of the non-profit and our activities. So I think we also have to learn on that, understand better the process was involved. Yeah, just exchange information with other countries involved, or maybe especially countries in Europe. Like Germany, but yeah, I have nothing special to add. As an example, I think what Neil said was the idea, the comparison with GMO, and yeah, nothing to add about it.
Okay, thanks. So I want to talk a bit more about, consumer acceptance and how we can engage with, the general public. So many people in policy believe that pre-market consumer acceptance of cellular agriculture will affect how these products will be regulated. Do you agree with this statement? Do you think that, what the general public think of cell ag before it even hits market, will that affect the regulation process? Maybe start with Neil. Keen to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, I guess I think it depends on what you think regulation is. And what aspects of regulation you're interested in. If you look at the previous talk by Elliot Schwartz from GFI, who gave this really detailed and interesting and rich account of many of the quality assurance aspects of trying to make sure that your bioreactors are sterile and that your harvesting is done in the proper way and all of that. If that's what you think the core element of regulation is, and certainly that is part of regulation, then I think that the role of publics is perhaps less explicit than in other areas. I really, really, really think the role of publics, and I personally much prefer the word publics to consumers for representing the autonomy that the people in general have. But the perspective of publics is vitally important in so many aspects of what is to do with cellular agriculture, cultured meat. I think some of these sterility aspects are not the key location for that. And I'm often reminded when people talk about issues of publics. Now, it's been a number of months since I've last seen anyone report on this, but I certainly remember Chris Bryant, who's great at this sort of stuff, once saying that, so Chris does a lot of studies on various people's perceptions, but he also does great work collating other people's studies into kind of cohesive analyses of those. And a point that he often makes is that if you ask, how many people support cultured meat, how many people don't, and then you have a third category, it's always the biggest. How many people have never heard of it? And that's still such a huge proportion. And many of the regulatory discussions are going on now. We've already heard projections, with projections that were only maybes, that possibly there'll be a regulatory process in place in parts of Asia before the end of this calendar year, which isn't very far away at all. So there's an interesting discussion about where publics sit in terms of what type of regulation. Now, government policy more broadly, absolutely. And I'd love to hear what other people on the panel have to say about that.
Yeah, it's a great point. Yeah, maybe I didn't mean consumer, but public. And, Sam at Food Frontier, you guys have successfully engaged with, the cattle industry and the Farmers Federation. So, yeah, I'd like to hear your thoughts on that too.
Sure, there's a couple of points there. The first, and linking back to your last question as well, around regulation, is that in my experience, it's easier to achieve influence over developing regulation, i.e., if there is to be new regulation in the cellular agriculture space, it's easier to influence the design of that regulation before it is implemented than it is to then fight a rearguard action and correct regulation that is not great once it's been implemented. My point there is that collectively, I think we have a responsibility to engage hard and early on regulation to ensure that it is in the interests of the sector more broadly once it's brought in. As we're seeing and drawing lessons from the plant-based space, it's almost like a set of dominoes around the world. If there is negative legislation in one jurisdiction, that will be used as a justification for negative legislation in another jurisdiction. It's a bit of a house of cards. Around that consumer or public education piece, I would say that we've undertaken a fair amount of consumer research based on plant-based. We did ask a few questions around cultivated meat of consumers, and there were nationally representative surveys of Australia and New Zealand. And what we found was consistent with what we saw in international surveys, in that the more education a consumer has when considering cultivated meat, the more likely they are to think favorably of the space. People are scared of what they don't know. What was interesting was when we had provided some of that information and asked the question around propensity to try cultivated meat, and then asked the same question again, but said, what if it was cheaper? The propensity to try increased significantly. So your question is around pre-market consumer acceptance of cellular agriculture. I'd say there's a significant amount of consumer or public, as Neil says, education that needs to be undertaken, but also there is a significant amount of education that needs to be undertaken with regulators, because this is new to most regulators and regulatory regimes around the world as well. And it goes back to the importance of good regulation at the start rather than correcting bad regulation, for example, around labeling. If we have to come up with contrived terminology that consumers don't understand, that's going to be likely damaging, and we need to do more research on that and exactly what the extent of that, the effect of that would be on propensity for consumers to purchase a cultivated meat. So there is a significant amount of research still to be done, I think, in each jurisdiction on consumer propensity to consume, but that needs to be matched, I think, with a concerted effort around education, both at the policy level, the national level, and at the public level.
I see Yadira nodding her head to a lot of the points you hit, Sam. Cellulaire Canada have done an amazing job at communicating that science, to the general public. So Yadira, I'm keen to hear your opinions on this too.
Yes, no, I agree with a lot of what Sam and Neil already said. I really think that when we talk about regulations, they really need to be based on the best available evidence that we have and the research that we have. But certainly, public perception can determine the course of action in the broader policymaking process. For example, if there is a certain fear of consumers to a certain technology or a certain product, that can influence the whole policymaking process again. And if they have a positive perception and they want something to go into the market, they can influence also as well that whole process. And I think it's important that we think about two main points. One is technology and food. Through history, we've seen that technology applied to food can cause certain fear to consumers because they wanna make sure that what they are ingesting is safe and that is good for their bodies. So it is important for us with cellular agriculture as a new technology that we're able to gain and to start gaining that trust of consumers in the technologies that we're using. Trust is gonna be crucial in this process. And the other thing that we really need to think about is we live in an era of mass media where consumers or the general public have access to any kind of information just with the click of a button. So we have to ensure that the information that we're provided to consumers is reliable, is transparent, and help us start gaining again that trust that we need. If we gain the trust of the public, that could help also streamline the process, the regulatory process in the general overview. So I think that now, as I'm saying, science communication and regulatory aspects are two things that have to be hand in hand with that development of the technology as well. If we really want to create a positive environment where cellular agriculture can thrive.
Yeah, it's all about. Sorry, yes, go Sam.
Yadira makes a really good point about access to media online. Largely, we do live in an era of instant information. We also live in an era of instant misinformation. So the messages that we collectively put out have to be evidence-based, and they have to be referred to. If you use, for example, the emergence of technologies in the past which have had controversy, and Neil earlier referred to genetically modified foods, it's not that the technology doesn't work, it's that there was, in certain parts of the world, they essentially lost the consumer perception argument, and that's something that we need to be aware of as we proceed.
Yeah, I completely agree. I feel like the cellular agriculture world is very English centric. So, you know, there is even more of a need to create all these documents and science communication resources in different languages. Nathalie, I love what you guys are doing at Cellulaire France with all of your translations. So I wonder if there are any examples that you could share where, you know, there are words or nomenclature that the international space have agreed on, like cultivated meat right now, and how does that translate into French? Does it work the same way?
Yes, I think we are lucky because in French we have very close translations, so that's working well. And from the beginning, I've been using the translation of culture and meat, and it's also the same translation as like cultivated meat. So I have one word for the both, and also the translation of Cellular Agriculture is very close, so that's easy. But I know that in German, that's much more complicated for them to find a good term. So I guess it really depends on the languages. And yeah, I was also, I really agree with the idea of educating regulators. I guess we have to do that. But I also think that it's important to try to inform the public, because if, for example, in France, we don't work on that. We already have people trying to inform the public with some very negative information and not accurate information. So I guess that if we let these people do that, we have only negative information available, at least in French. And we have, I guess, the public not understanding the potential benefits of cellular agriculture. And then I guess that the policymakers will also not understand the potential benefits of cellular agriculture, and they will see an opposition coming from the public. So don't think they will make so many efforts trying just regulating the product. So I think it's also important for the people working in the regulations to see that there is a demand from the potential consumers as well. Yeah.
Great, thanks Nathalie. We've got quite a few questions here, so I might get started on that. Shiraz says, are there any deep-rooted differences in opinion within cattle farming and advocacy groups in each country? Are the panelists able to find and make contact with representatives in their respective countries? Might start with Sam there.
Thanks, Bianca. The easy questions. Are there deep-rooted differences of opinion? I think was the start of that question. I think there are progressive voices in the majority of sectors, and that is also true of farming. It has not gone unnoticed in Australia, as in other markets, I imagine, that some of the bigger or biggest meat companies in the world have repositioned themselves as protein providers and invested as you all know, in cellular agriculture ventures. The same is true in Australia. They are watching these developments internationally, and they are aware, the advocacy bodies in this country as in other countries, that their own members are making these investments. So it's not something that is ignored or can be ignored. There are progressive voices. We've had conversations with the president of the National Farmers Federation, for example. This was with respect to plant-based meat, who runs cattle on a property in New South Wales, but also grows chickpeas, so can see both sides of the story, and is very pragmatic about the opportunity to supply a new supply chain. The New Zealand market, for example, Beef and Lamb New Zealand have produced quite early on a discussion paper looking at plant-based and cultivated meat, the emergence of that. They commissioned it in late 2017, published in early 2018. And that paper was intended to inform their sector on how to position themselves with respect to the emergence of these new technologies. So recognizing these things are coming, how do we position ourselves with respect to them? So I think that was quite a forward-thinking conversation that they were having in New Zealand. So yeah, I think there are progressive voices in the agriculture sector, just as there are in other sectors.
Great, thanks, Sam. That's a really great success story. Neil, you mentioned before that you're trying to include as many diverse voices in your forum over in the UK. Could you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, sure. As I said, we haven't really been as successful at it as perhaps we hoped. We did have a program of work planned for this calendar year where we were really going to try to address that, to get a lot of diverse people from agriculture, from the environmental movement, to come together to have a rich and sort of sustained discussion of that. That was our big body of work for this year. Unfortunately, for the reasons that most people's years have changed from what they initially anticipated, we haven't pursued it at this time, and we've postponed it. We were literally going to start it in April, and like the rest of the world, April was not the time to be starting new initiatives. One interesting aspect about Cultivate that's perhaps a little different to some of the others is that all 5 of the people that founded it and run it have lives engaging with cellular agriculture outside of Cultivate. To run a company, I do my academic research on it. So some of that engagement is done, but by us with different hats on. So ICTID, for example, who I mentioned earlier, is and has been a farmer and is very involved in the networks of farming around the UK, and has those discussions. And sometimes it can be difficult. We spent some time with someone from the National Farmers Union who, similar to the previous point, they represent people that make plants as well as people who farm animals. So it's a complex one that's going to take some time.
Great, thanks, Neil. We've got another question from Vince. Are you acting on behalf of the cell ag industry in an agnostic manner? So regardless of the meat or seafood types and regardless of the consumers, including pets. So how do you cater to the specific regulatory needs? Yadira, I'd be keen to hear your thoughts on that.
That's a really good question. I think the position CAC is trying to be as neutral as possible, and trying to be more like I call it like a bridge builder, a community that is trying to engage the different stakeholders and try to bring all that information and share it and promote an engagement conversation between all of them. I think that's a unique position that we have as not only us, but any other not-for-profit. So be neutral and trying to act in the benefit of the whole field. Again, I think cellular agriculture has a huge potential to do good to society in general. And I think we have to keep that essence as alive as possible. And regardless of if we're consumers, if we're industry, or we're researchers.
Yeah, it's a fine line to balance between being advocates, but also being as evidence-based as possible. So yeah, that's a really good point. We have another question from Veronica to all the speakers. What do you think the biggest impact would be that a nonprofit could make in the cell ag field? Maybe Nathalie, it'd be great to hear your thoughts on this.
Maybe for now, it would be just to have more people aware of what is cellular agriculture and what are the potential benefits of this product. Because for now, well, most of the people, they never heard of that. And some of them, they heard of that, but in a very negative way. So yeah, I guess just providing good, neutral, science-based information to people would be the first step and a good start.
I would add to that, Bianca, that education piece is really important. Another role I think that we are perhaps uniquely positioned to play is bringing together the cellular agriculture companies within our various jurisdictions and areas that we operate in. We've seen a few of those have viewed other cell ag companies as potential competitors, which is interesting given that there's no commercial product at the moment. And we see in Australia, we're very lucky. We have companies that are looking at scaffolding, that are looking at cell media, that are looking at growing meat itself. So we have the ecosystem of cellular agriculture companies represented really just here within our own country. So bringing them together and in a pre-competitive way to learn lessons, and there will be lessons that they can learn from each other, and providing that forum is a role I think not-for-profits can play.
Thanks, Sam. Neil, what do you think the biggest impact a non-profit can make in the sector?
Well, I think you could look at New Harvest and GFI. I think they're both doing pretty well. I'd actually like to skip back. I'd like to take this moment. There was a question earlier about how non-profits collaborate globally, and I didn't mention, and no one else, and I feel bad that I didn't mention the work that you've been doing, Bianca, because you're doing this fantastic thing that's bringing together third sector groups. In fact, that's kind of how this forum came together, right? That this is how I've met a number of other people who are doing this in other parts of the country. So I saw there was another question about how some of us are collaborating internationally. And I think the point to make is that this is a relatively new thing. I think it'll be continuing, and we should celebrate Bianca for doing that work. So thank you.
Thanks, Neil. Yeah, I actually have a slide after the questions to just briefly explain about that. But going back to that last question, Neil, what do you think the national nonprofits can do best for the sector?
Yeah, okay. So we focus on something that Sam said about sort of networking, which is bringing people together, giving people the opportunity to have conversations. But we also focus on, as I said earlier, not necessarily just trying to bring the cell ag gang together, but we try to get people to have this, I was going to say disgusting, that's not difficult conversations, and we hope to do more of that. There's been some talk about the role of education towards publics, our consumers. I'm going to come with a different perspective on that, and maybe I'll go back to the talk about genetically modified crops. I mean, in the UK, the general kind of institutional reflection on that is that a big part of the problem around genetically modified crops was the use of what was called the deficit model of public engagement, which is this idea that if people just understand the science better, if we just educate people better, then they're more likely to have value judgments that mean that they will share with scientists, we being the scientists as people construct this, because there's lots of different scientists, lots of different perspectives, and that if we inform people in this very one-way direction, that's the solution. And the story within the UK after and we went big on disputes about GM crops, was very much to have a much more dialogic model, something called Upstream Engagement, which involves engaging with publics, but actually listening, more than teaching, listening to publics and being prepared to change what you do in that context. So that has to be informed. Cultivate has always been about informing. You want to have informed dialogue, because you can have misinformed dialogue, and I do think there's been examples of that, both from people who are against cellular agriculture and also people who support cellular agriculture at times. So I've never been a big fan of overuse of the word education without the word dialogue following up very, very quickly indeed. So I would say that the third sector groups would be great in pushing that forward in a way that it's not easy for companies to do that, because they have different motivating factors and different constraints placed upon them. So a different answer there, but that's why I'm here, right?
Can I add something to that? I totally agree with Neil, and I think one of the most important things when we talk about science communication or public engagement is the fact that we have to get out of the bubble where we are right now, of the CELAC bubble, and we really need to go where the people are. And I think that's a really good, a strong position that we have as not-for-profits, is reaching out and going there where the public is. And especially when we talk about people that they don't have so easy access to information or to scientific information. So we have that advantage of being able to reach out to them and go there. For example, before COVID hit here in Canada, we were able to attend a STEM fair for high school students, where we were able to talk to them. And the good thing about that is that we didn't only talk to the students, but we also talked to the parents, and we taught them and explained what cellular agriculture was. And it was fascinating to see their faces of surprise and like, really, is this coming out? Like, are we going to have this kind of products? So I think that's a value that we can provide to the field, going out there and teaching all the people that maybe companies or other stakeholders might not be able to reach. And also the fact that, as Neil mentioned, that we need to bring all the different voices, even the ones that are not really or directly involved in cellular agriculture. So we can provide that forum where those conversations can happen.
Yeah, I totally agree with all of your points there. And yes, thank you, Neil, for bringing up the International Cellular Agriculture Nonprofit Consortium. I've got a slide here. So about 5 months ago, I think, when I was, developing Cellular Agriculture Australia, I wanted to see what other nonprofits in the space were tackling some of the issues in the industry. So, I reached out to all of the nonprofit associations around the world who are dedicated to advocating for Cell Ag, and so we had a meeting in July, I think, across, I think 11 different countries. So finding a meeting time was really difficult, but it was really, really great to inform each of us, what everyone's doing, what our similarities and what our differences are, and how we can best leverage our international relationships. And so, yes, we've developed this consortium where we can coordinate strategies, share resources, help each other find funding, and that's really important, and basically just learn from each other. So, yeah, we've got this consortium, and if there's anyone out there who is thinking of starting an organization in your own country and you haven't gotten in touch with us already, please shoot me an email at info@cellagaustralia.org, and I'll add you to the Slack channel, and we'll be meeting up sometime soon, maybe early next year. So with that, I'd just like to thank all of the speakers here today. You are doing incredible work in your organizations, and this field wouldn't be where we are today if it weren't for your work. So thank you so much. And thanks again to the organizers, to the audience members for tuning in, and hope to see you all in person sometime soon. Thanks, everyone.